thank you for joining me. Ahead of my new series on making miniature food, I thought it might be a nice idea to share with you the tools and materials that I use for working with polymer clay. Okay, so a good place to start is by getting yourself an old biscuit tin to actually store your clay in, and this will keep it fresher for longer. And some of these in here have been in here for probably a good 10 years. I think that was probably when I started using polymer clay. And I've got several different shades in here, and I've got a mixture of classic and soft. Now I find the classic one really easy to use and easy to soften up as well. So I'm not sure what the actual difference between them is. Perhaps somebody could enlighten me, somebody who perhaps knows a little bit more than I do. And the smaller size are these 56-gram size blocks, and then you can buy the larger blocks, which is 350 gram. And I've got the larger blocks in some of the more popular colours that I use, and that's a champagne and a chocolate. And this is what's left of my 350 gram white bar, tiny little bit there, so that's obviously the most popular colour, and also a translucent. And translucent is really good for making things like grapes and any sort of foods that have got that sort of translucent appearance. I use it for pickled onions, and you can mix it with other colours as well, and the solid colours, to make even more shades, as indeed you can with all of the colours. You can mix them to make sort of endless shades. I think the basic shades are available in around 24 different colours. And then I've also got in here, see if I can find it, there's a clay called Fimo Effect, and actually the translucent clay is part of the Effects range, and this one as well, which is called Granite. And look at it, it's got that lovely sort of glittery effect to it. I don't know if you can see that there. Now I've never used this, but if I remember rightly, I actually bought this to make cheese boards, Granite Effect cheese boards. So we might have a go at that. I've always sort of displayed my cheese on like a real stone tile. But I thought it might be more effective to use this, so we'll give that a go. And then what I've got here, once you've mixed your clay, if you don't end up using it, you can store it in your tin, and I always put them in these little plastic bags just to keep it fresh and to stop any other clays or dirt getting onto them. And I've got a little bit of yellow and white mixture there, which I would use for apples and potatoes and things like that. And then here I think is the champagne, and this piece I've used a bit of texture in, but we'll get onto that in a moment. But anything you've mixed up isn't wasted, because you can always store it. And if you mix a lot of colours, you could always put a bit of paper in there, or a sticker on the front saying what colours and what proportions you've mixed. And then also in there I've got this, I think it's pronounced Cernit modelling clay, and this was free on the front of a magazine, and I thought I'd give it a go, but I've never gotten around to that, so I don't know what the quality of this one is like, but hopefully now I'll get around to giving that a go. So a couple of people have already messaged to say that they've had some polymer clay in a drawer for many years and they're not sure if it's still usable. And I must admit, some of these have gone quite hard, but I did just try pulling a little bit off and just warming it up in my hands, and that worked really well. The clay just went back to being really soft and pliable. So I'm pretty sure you'll be okay, but just give it a try when we get around to the tutorials. And you can also buy clay softener, So you can buy, I think it's like a liquid, and you would mix it in with the clay and then knead it together to soften the clay up. But I think rather than go into a possibly unnecessary expense, just try warming it up first. So that's the clay, and I think I've got all the colours in there that we're going to need to get started. And I've got some clays on order, only the smaller sizes, but in all of these popular colours that I use, like I say, just to get you started. But I know once you've given this a try, you're going to fall in love with it and you're going to want to order more colours. So I will sort of start stocking the whole range of colours available. Okay, let's put this away. So as you progress in the hobby, you also might find it useful to have a couple of little storage boxes, and these ones have got sections inside like that, so ideal for storing all the little bits and pieces that you're going to need. So I'll just go through each one and show you what I've sort of collected since I've been doing it. So I've got quite a lot of cutters in here in various sizes. Now, I think these came as a set, but I must admit I've never used these larger ones. I mainly use these two smaller sizes for sort of cakes, large cheeses, and then this one for, again, smaller cakes, biscuits and things like that. And the same with these oval ones. I sort of bought them all when I just started out in the hobby, thinking that I would need them, but actually you don't always need all of these cutters, depending on what you're making, of course, but you can use other methods of certainly of cutting squares and oblongs and things like that. So don't rush into buying too much equipment until you know sort of what you can do without these sort of cutters and things. I've actually got quite a lot of them in there in different sizes. The circle one goes in there. So certainly it's difficult to cut circles by hand, so probably invest in a couple of small cutters, but these square ones, I think you'll find you'll be able to cut squares and oblongs quite easily without them. And then I've also got the top of a little plastic, or the bit that goes on the top of a paintbrush. I've kept one of those in there, and I think I've used that for texturing in the past. I've also got these tiny little cutters that sort of press down like that, so you would cut out the shape and then pop that down to push the clay out of the barrel, and they're really handy, and I've made biscuits and sweets with those, and they come in all sorts of shapes and sizes. I've got a teardrop in there, a star, a heart and a circle. They're really nice. And then the blades that we use are called these sort of single-edged blades, and I really need to sort these out because half of these are probably blunt and some of them are even going rusty, so I'll just keep the newer ones of those and dispose carefully of the other ones. But that's the type of blade that I use. And you can also use a blade in a handle, and a curved blade is really useful, and I'll get some of those as well for the shop. Here I've got some marbles, and these are actually really good for shaping clay around to make bowls and things like that, and these can go into the oven when you bake the clay. So I've got a couple of different sizes in there as well. And then also in this section I've got some poppy seeds, and these are really good for texturing and for using as sprinkles on top of breads and things like that. And then I've got a couple of spare blades in there as well. And then in here I've got some more texturing materials, and I've got a bit of wadding, and things like this are really good for sort of pressing into the clay to create texture in it for making certain food items. I've got a piece of lace there for doing the same, and you can see I've used that after I've coloured the clay using chalk pastels, and you just sort of bunch it up and press it into the clay and you get some really nice texture and patterns with that. The same with a piece of tin foil, and then I've got some really harsh sandpaper in there as well for the same, again great for texturing. I've got a couple of needles in here, quite a large sewing needle there, and a pin as well, and I just keep them pressed in that eraser just so they're easy to get hold of. And again, these are for texturing, and I would use a pin to create a sort of crumb effect in a cut piece of cake or in a sliced piece of bread. And that's a really fabulous, simple little technique to use to create a really realistic look in bread and cakes. I've got a pencil sharpener in there, not quite sure why. And then you can also buy little moulds, and these are for making, I don't know if you can see that there, but little tarts. So you would make your clay into the colour that you wanted the tart base to be, press it in there, and then pop that out and bake it in the oven as usual. And then you can top that with icing or cream or something like that. In here, now this looks sort of like a spare nose, but it's actually a mould for a plate. So I used a ceramic plate and made this mould again using polymer clay, and then you would put your clay in there and then press it down with this piece to shape into a little plate. So we'll perhaps try some of that as well, and the sort of substance you can see on there is actually just talc, and that helps to get the clay out of your mould. So that's a good little technique. And I've got a couple of smaller ones in there that I've made and obviously used for something, but I can't remember, maybe just flattening the clay down. And then also in there are just a top of something that I've kept for cutting out clay. So you don't have to spend a lot of money on metal cutters. You can actually just use things that you find laying around, pen tops, lids from things. If you start getting into this hobby, you can start building up a really nice little collection of tools and materials to create shapes and textures and things. And also in there I've got lots of lids for little jars, and they're for when I make pickles, just bunging up the jar. So that's that. So I had in my little storage box there some poppy seeds for texturing bread, and I've also got here some ground rice, and that's really good for texturing the clay when you're making bread, and some corn flour, again used for the same, a little bit finer than the ground rice. And then here I've got some sesame seeds, and these work really well as almonds on cakes and biscuits and things like that. When you're actually using the clay, a really good surface to use is a ceramic tile, and I've got quite a few of these, and you could work with the clay on one of the tiles and then put your shaped pieces onto another tile, and that can then actually be placed into the oven to bake. Here I've got a nylon roller. You could also use a glass bottle, but don't use a wooden ruler as the clay will stick to it. And you can actually use plain flour as you would in normal baking. Just apply a layer over your roller as you would to stop the clay from sticking to it. And then I actually use chalk pastels to colour the clay. Now you can use enamel paint, but I actually find that the chalk pastels give a more natural colour, and you would use the pastel on the clay before you've baked it, and then the colour just bakes in. And you can also, once it's baked, use a varnish. And I've got a matte varnish here, and it's actually nice for if you're sort of putting icing on cakes and things like that, and that will just add a more realistic look. Here I've got something called Fimo Liquid Deco Gel, and again this works as a sort of varnish as well to give it a sort of glistening look, but it also works as a glue, so you can use that to stick like a layer of icing on top of a cake or something like that. And then it's really important to keep your hands clean when you're working with your clay, because the clay will pick up any sort of bits of dirt, and if you've been working with several different colours, you'll contaminate the paler colours. So I always have these wipes handy and just keep my hands really clean as I'm working. And you can also use these to keep your tools and your roller and your tile clean as well. It's really important that you don't let any dirt get into the clay. And the final thing I want to show you, and this is classed as an absolute luxury item when using polymer clay, is this pasta machine. And this is used for rolling out the clay really flat, for when you're making icing and really fine crackers maybe and things like that. But like I say, it's a real luxury item, and I certainly wouldn't recommend you rushing out to buy one before you're sure that you really enjoy the hobby. And anything like this you must just use for polymer clay. You know, don't use the one that you've got in your kitchen and then go back to making pasta in it again, because obviously the polymer clay can be toxic. Talking again about that, I showed you the ceramic tile that I use for working with the clay and for baking the clay. If you don't have a tile, then you could use just a normal metal baking tray. But again, reserve one just for your polymer clay. Don't use the one that's sort of in your kitchen and then put it back in the kitchen cupboard, because that's extremely dangerous. I hope you found that interesting and that it's inspired you to have a go at making miniature food and putting together your own collection of tools and materials. Now, since recording that section, I have discovered that the 56-gram blocks of Vimo polymer clay have been discontinued and replaced with the 85-gram blocks. Now, I did manage to get hold of a few of the smaller blocks, and you'll find those in my Etsy shop, but from now on I will be stocking the 85-gram blocks of all colours, and I'll be building up that colour range over the coming weeks and months. Now, as I said in my last vlog, I'm far from an expert in this field, so what I showed you there really are the very basic tools, but enough really to get you started in the hobby. Now, over the last couple of days I've spoken to a couple of suppliers of the clays and tools and accessories, so I will be adding some tools and things like cutters to my Etsy shop, and they'll build up as well over the coming weeks and months. And I think you'll find as you progress in the hobby, you'll be developing your own ways of shaping and texturing your clay, which you can do with a number of household items. And I think that's a really fun part of the hobby as well, always being on the lookout for things that you can add to your little toolkit. Now, I feel at this stage I should warn you that once you start making miniature food, you'll never want to stop, so follow this series at your peril. Now, I'm really looking forward to starting this series, and I hope you're going to enjoy it. And I'll be uploading the first video early next week, and we're going to be making some cookies and biscuits. I thought we'd start off with something fairly simple. I hope you'll be joining me for that first episode. I'll see you then. Bye.